Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. This is episode 25. And if this is the first time you're here, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4IS, and this is my co-host, Mr. E. So, Mr. E, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4IS. How are you?
Yeah, I'm going pretty well. And I thought this topic was a good one, like a good follow on from what we were discussing before about self-interest, and
Okay.
that is politicians. Now,
Ooh.
now, the reason why I brought this up is actually the impetus for me wanting to do this topic is I heard a very interesting line from a democratic socialist that I follow, and it was about what's happening here in Australia, like, well, really what's happening pretty much everywhere over the world, where um, the RBA or the central bank here in Australia is raising interest rates that's causing inflation, though
Yep.
really there's more to it, especially with all of the recent studies that have come out of Australia Institute, where really it's a profit price spiral rather than a wage price spiral. But that's a bit of a tangent.
Yep.
But
Yep.
this person discussing that kind of phenomenon came
Mm.
out and was saying, well, really all the central bank is doing, the RBA, is just pushing the button to increase interest rates, and that's just increasing inflation. That's increasing cost of living, and it's basically hurting working families. And
Yep.
then they said something very interesting. They were like,
Mm.
"Hey, we need to lobby our community groups. We need to protest about this sort of thing." And then he said, because leaders are, sorry, politicians are followers, they're not leaders.
Ooh.
And I thought that was a very
Mm.
interesting take
Yeah.
because, everyone knows that they're very public figures and
Hmm. Hmm.
hey, you need to be an orator of sorts, and it's I guess there's the heuristics around it that you kind of just assume that they're leaders, but at
Right.
least their logic, what this democratic socialist logic was, is that, well, it's not until you uh, push them on a certain topic,
Mm.
like unless it's kind of low-hanging fruit that they know it's within the public interest, they just won't naturally push on an issue.
Yeah.
And I thought we would basically discuss that today
Mm.
because I thought it was just a very interesting take to consider um, politicians as followers rather than leaders.
Right.
What do you think about that sort of assertion? Because it's a very bold thing to say.
Well, yeah, I think there is validity to that. There is this perception out there that because I guess someone is an elected official, that somehow entitles them to be a leader in their community and a champion of some type of issue or cause. But like if you think of it in like a two-party type of system, then if you have an elected official, they probably voted in some type of utilitarian type of
Mhm.
system where it's just like maybe they've only got a slight majority, but they're still the elected officials. So the question has to be asked, are they really representing most of the people in their electorate? And the answer is, well, if you consider like 51% the majority, then yes. But if, there's like a large section of the people out there that wouldn't have voted for this person, are they leading their community? Are they leading their constituents at all? Now, I think that politicians are definitely expected to be role models. So they're expected to act with a certain code of conduct and as an air of authenticity and have an ethical nature and all of these, high quality style attributes, which, you know, very um, well, funnily enough, people don't actually
Mm.
associate any of those things with politicians. They actually expect them to play dirty tricks and play all the backdoor games and all that sort of stuff that comes with like the political realm. But in terms of being leaders, I think inherently the system doesn't allow them to be leaders, in the sense that
Mm,
they are in the positions that they are in a voting system because they have to get elected. And so they are beholden to the whims of the electorate
mm,
and public opinion. So if they can master riding the wave of public opinion well enough, then they will catch the next wave and be on board for the next, the next cycle and such. But if they fall off for any reason, then that's it, they're out of the game. So they must follow the swell wherever it may go to ride the wave of their political careers. I don't believe they are groundbreaking, avant-garde, or any of those types of things in any stretch of the imagination. Like, you can have kind of populist um, politicians or charismatic leaders that may break that mold.
mm,
And they are actually leaders. They might start their own party, or they might revolutionize a party and bring it to the fore. But that is usually antithetical to democracy, because they end up becoming like an entity in their own right, because they are so charismatic or they are so popular,
mm,
and they actually are leading, but they're not riding any waves of public opinion there. They're probably more dictatorial than anything
mm.
else. So, like, yeah, if you are a politician in a liberal democratic system, um, you are not expected to be a leader, as it were. I think a role model is more akin to what they are.
Well, let's look at this. Let's shift gears. Let's look at this philosophically. Um, when you when you think of basically with everything that you were just kind of saying there, there's almost a contradiction. And what I mean by that is, well, let's use a little bit of corporate speak. In a sense, a politician has a fiduciary relationship to who they represent and basically the general public. And for those of you who don't know, when I say fiduciary responsibility, it's usually directed towards directors of a company, and it's because a fiduciary responsibility is basically they have a responsibility to act reasonably and in good faith for the shareholders of the company, for the employees of the company, and that sort of thing. So,
Mm,
using that sort of terminology, they should, politicians, with who they represent within the general community, they have they should be representing them, or at least doing things in their best interests, whatever sort of policies that they table in parliament and that sort of thing.
mm,
But that is directly in opposition with the campaign trail, with running for office. That say you have policy X and policy Y. Policy X might be more applicable to the community. For example, say something as bold as a universal basic income. That would be really important to a working class area. But then you have policy Y, which is let's say, I noticed that there's a whole bunch of teachers in my area. Um, I have this really good policy about, hey, I'm going to implement 10,000 teacher jobs in the local area. I'm
mm,
not saying that policy X and policy Y, one's worse than the other, but the thing is, policy Y is a lot easier to sell to the public.
mm,
And also, it's a lot easier for them to digest. So the the politician is incentivized to go for the less controversial one, even though if they fought for it, and maybe if we had a scenario where the media was less biased, for example,
mm.
um, they would actually opt for the universal basic income
Yep,
because
yep. Well,
it's
and
yeah,
that's what I'm saying as well. Like
yeah.
they are riding waves of popular opinion,
Mm,
and like they are subject to that wave. And so like they're not going to step outside the square and risk things. And like leadership requires a level of that. They need to be groundbreaking, they need to be at the forefront, they need to trailblaze, and there's a level of risk, an inherent risk that comes with being a leader, and a good one. You need to be able to sum up a situation, and like because you've got so much, I guess, clout, and you work with such authority, and like I don't mean that like, you know, just being granted authority. You can
mm,
build that on your own, and you have authority because people want to follow you. You have to take the risk to go forward, and like people will believe and have faith in you, and so you can take that next step and do what you need to do to progress. But like politicians don't have any of that within them. There may be a handful of them out there, but even they are institutionalized. So even like a maverick politician or an outsider or someone that you would think is, working within their like kind of their own game and playing within their own tune, they're still probably part of a party. And
mm,
like they're subject to the whims of that party. And at election time, they're subject to the whims of their voter base. So, you know, that's that is the thing about politicians. They aren't free agents, and they aren't elected, I don't think, because they have the ability to make decisions. Most elected officials don't have that type of role in a parliamentary system, if that's what we're talking about,
mm.
politicians here or in Congress or something like that.
Yeah.
They might vote on issues that are tabled on the floor of parliaments and all that sort of stuff. But like, I guess the real power would come with someone who has executive power. So like maybe if you were the head of your party, or you were the head of the house, or the head of your nation,
Mm,
or something like that. So those type of politicians, they might lend themselves to being leaders because, if they don't do that type of stuff during their tenure, then they probably won't get re-elected again. But like your average politician is like a placeholder, a seat
mm.
warmer. They have a very particular role, and it's, not even a delegation kind of thing. It's just they're in for a certain term, and they try to promote a certain agenda and work within their constituents' interests. But like, a lot of it is just rocking up to unveiling ceremonies, cutting ribbons, and kissing babies. It's That's a role model, that's a public figure. But like I don't know if that's the two are interchangeable, being a public figure and being a leader. I don't think they are always the same thing.
Yeah, because I think that's the reason why also we should go back to a point that I've said before with Eric Olin Wright, which was the idea of taming capitalism, because I guess the state, or at least the way the state has been structured, going from embedded liberalism when, the workforce and at least working people were in a really good position within society, and then neoliberalism coming out, and then I guess the state apparatus being slowly chipped away by the private sector till we kind of have what we have nowadays. And that when you do consider the state, or at least politicians, and how they're incentivized to play the game of politics nowadays, um, that's the reason why it's Eric Olin Wright says that taming capitalism is the way it is. It's basically its job is, oh, hey, why don't we just regulate companies, and oh, hey, maybe you shouldn't exploit your workers, or maybe you shouldn't exploit a different company in order to get returns for your shareholders. And it wasn't really until the days beforehand, during embedded liberalism, or even before that, when you had the ideas of reforming capitalism. So you actually had the old school socialist parties or even communist parties that deliberately were trying to change the system. Whereas I think it goes to what you were saying before, politicians and at least um, parties nowadays within politics, they are institutionalized. They are uh, they have their little slot within the system. They may criticize each other. So, say in Australian politics, the Labor Party is going to criticize the Liberals, the Greens are going to criticize the Labor Party, and then everyone's criticizing themselves. But you don't hear anyone saying, um, "Oh, is capitalism a good system or not?" You
Yeah,
just
is the system good, or any type of questioning of the system at large? It's all, you know, infighting and political games within the system.
Yes, and look, I also want to put a disclaimer out there that hey, I actually am a member of the ALP. I must admit that I did join when I was far more naive. But I am actually part of the left faction of the Labour Party, but I wouldn't say getting much more involved in politics it hasn't made me more disillusioned. It's just made the experience much more complicated.
Hmm.
And it brings us back to what we were talking about before is are politicians leaders or followers? And uh, some of the because hey, we're actually leading up to the New South Wales state election that's going to be happening next week. I can already tell you right now that some of the policy situations that Labourers has instituted, um, that some of them have come from the rank and file, and without revealing too much information, we had to push them on certain aspects of public housing, like them pushing to make sure um, that they actually were going uh, to push policies to the general public about that for the inner west area.
Yeah,
And it goes back to my example that I was saying before. You have policy X, which is probably in the public's best interest, or policy Y, which is a lot more sellable or marketable.
yeah,
And we had to push them to do policy X.
yeah.
But we got there in the end, but you had to push the
Mm.
politicians.
And see, I think that's why they are, or demonstrates why they're not leadership types. Because a leader, I think, or an effective leader anyway, knows, like I said before, that there is a level of risk that's inherent in decision making, and like to take the organization, to take the country, to take whoever where they need to get to, then you have to make sometimes unfavorable decisions, and you have to be able to withhold against that onslaught in the initial stages, before people see the fruits of whatever that decision you're making. And you should be able to survive through that. And then everyone's like, oh, that's why they made that call. That's why they did that thing. And so, like, if politicians are always pandering to the most marketable ideal, even though it's not in the public's best interests, and at the end of the day, publics, I think, are still public servants, then they're not leaders and they're not doing the right thing. They're only looking
Mm.
after their self-interest. And so, like, yeah, I think that's why they're more akin to a public figure as such than anything else. Because, yeah, they're elected and all that sort of stuff, but they really are supposed to be looking after the public interest and advancing the public interests as they see best, in line with their political views and the I guess the views of their party and things like that. But ultimately, they are trying to make the or put the public at the forefront of their decision-making process. And as that, like in that type of role as a public official, then they have a very defined way of working within that system. And so, like, there's limitations on what they can do. they must vote on certain issues and they must attend certain gatherings and like all these type of ceremonial stuff, which is like akin to, I don't know, like some type of religious rite or like religious event. They're more like, players in some type of ceremony as opposed to the leading figures in change or industries that drive social change and economic change and all that sort of stuff. They're the people that like are lobbied to maybe get things through that might affect the people that are out there leading communities and all that sort of stuff and leading the economy and what have you. So they have power, don't get me wrong. They have access to great power and they
Mm.
have the ability to withhold and regulate great power. Um, and they can do that through passing legislation and
Yeah.
like reforms and regulation and all that type of stuff. But they can't do it alone. And I think that's what a leader does. They do things alone.
Yeah, and again, I think we have talked about the idea of the Overton window before.
Hmm.
And um, for those of you who don't know, the Overton window is basically a concept that within a time period or within a political system, there are ideas that you can talk within the Overton window, and then there's some policies that are just not relevant anymore or are completely removed. So a classic case would be if you talked about prohibition, which was obviously a hot topic near the start of the 20th century. If you talked about prohibition nowadays, people would think that you're mad. Um, and it's just like those sort of talking points are just simply not relevant to the 21st century. And it's almost as if it's the whole idea of don't hate the player, hate the game.
Mm,
And that brings us to the idea of, well, if really taming capitalism, or at least the current political system, is all about regulating, or at least not being able to regulate properly,
mm.
then is regulation really enough? If the game uh, is rigged, if you will, then how do you kind of change the system, or at least turn those followers into leaders?
Well,
Yeah.
and that's like the ultimate question of like, I think most revolutionary movements for the last 150 years.
Mm,
And that would be reform or revolution,
mm,
right? Like, do you work with the system that you have and better it, or do you knock it down and start again? And like that is the ultimate like argument within the revolutionary culture, right? And so like there are obviously massive proponents of each. And I would say politicians would probably be sitting on the side of reform rather than revolution, because obviously, like we've talked about already, they're institutionalized for one, and like they don't want to put themselves out of a job because they are not really leaders. So leaders will make tough decisions and they might even choose to go in a direction which makes them redundant, but they
mm,
know it's good for the cause kind of thing, so they don't mind doing it. But like I don't see politicians doing anything that might harm their interests, like even like I mean ultimately harm their
mm,
interests, like make them redundant. Like they'll do things like they'll make hard choices and sometimes like go out on a limb, don't get
mm.
me wrong, but like we said before, they're not out there, any of the political parties anywhere, advocating to revolutionize the system. There is
Yeah.
no real revolutionary parties anymore. There used to be
Yeah.
revolutionary workers' parties that were assigned or associated with the revolutionary movement. There was the political struggle as well as the economic struggle, and Marx talks heavily about that. But like there is no political struggle anymore. There are players that work within the system and try to, like we are talking about, reform things and try and
Mm.
make things a little bit better by bringing in nice legislation or regulating things. But like, can you Can you reform the system in such a way that makes significant change? Like, could you turn a liberal democracy in a capitalist society, which is basically, I think, would best fit most of the Western world and everything else really that we have now in this post-Cold War era. But like, can you change a liberal democracy in a capitalist society to be something like the quote that sparked all this discussion from a democratic socialist? So, democratic socialist, correct me if I'm wrong here, is just somebody that believes that you can have a socialist country or a socialist society based on the same type of democratic principles that you would have in a liberal democracy. So you have,
Mm.
you know, people that are elected to a parliament or a congress or some type of parliamentary system. They represent the interests of their constituents, but like all of the whole economy and the direction of society works towards socialist aims. And that's, taking, I guess, more social policies on and looking to plan economics in a socialist style, which
Mm.
is like, it's not real socialism, as it were, working within the neat framework of a liberal democracy, but like it's getting to lovely ideas and kind of smashing them
Yeah,
together.
making it a hybrid, but then
Yeah.
again, like it's like even to the what you were talking about before that reform or revolution, you can even you can even see, well, the now current Prime Minister of Australia, but at the time he was the opposition leader leading up to the federal election. One of his main talking points, or at least whenever he did the preamble to any of his speeches, he would always say, hey, we want to build a better future. We want to create a renewal within Australia, not a revolution.
Mm.
Those specific words came out of his mouth. And um, the reason why that's stuck in my mind is it goes back to what you were saying before. After all, it is Rosa Luxemburg's, one of her most famous books. And yes, the fact is that there is no revolutionary parties anymore, or at least there isn't. To go back to Vladimir Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder, there is no yielding to the mood of revolution, especially in a Western democracy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's outside the Overton window, if you will.
Yeah. And it's really unfortunate because political parties, like working political parties, that were born out of union movements and stuff like that, they were meant to be associated with the end goal, which is the revolution. And so, like, Marx always proposed that you have economic struggle. So that's like going on strike or forming a
Hmm.
picket line or, you're sucking it to the boss and the man, like out on the streets. But then you also have the political side of things where the workers come together to represent themselves within the actual political process, with the end game of like, once you have an established understanding of like how everything works on the economic level and
Hmm.
like how businesses run, how the country functions in terms of production and all of the things that come together to give people the goods and services they need. And then you have the political system, the overarching administration of all of those things. And you have the workers like involved in both of those forms of struggle. Then with those two things combined, because one and not the other, like, it's not the whole system. And so you need both of those working concurrently to understand both systems and to enlighten the
Hmm.
workers of the world about the importance of each systems and the workings of each system. And then with those struggles continually developing and expanding and becoming more and more potent, then you can lead a revolution. There will be a tipping point at some point, like where quantitative changes turn into qualitative changes, and there will be a
Hmm.
tipping point, and then the the workers' parties in terms of how they are as organizations of workers, and then organizations of the political representation of the workers will be able to inherit the system, and at that point choose whether to reform it
Mm,
or completely, revolutionize it and start again. But you have to have those two things going in order to have a revolutionary moment. You might not even have to have those two things going concurrently to have moments of reform, because
mm,
reform is almost inherent in the capitalist system, because like capitalists will be the first to tell you that like they love reform because reform is the thing that really feeds capitalism, I think, in a sense that in the capitalist society, while there is so much like of these kind of people that like to that are proponents of the free market and like, you know, unfettered, unrestrained capitalism and laissez-faire kind of
mm,
styles of economics and all that sort of stuff. It's all nonsense because they really rely on governments quite heavily to have tariffs and barriers up to protect businesses and to
mm,
protect certain groups and interest groups and others from outside influence, and like make sure that there are certain rules and regulations around to protect industries and all that sort of stuff, and protect patents and intellectual property and all this sort of stuff to prop up business and to like divert like public funds into certain research
mm,
areas to support technological growth, to support business, and the whole system feeds off government. Like the
mm,
entire system feeds off government. And so reform is integral to the capitalist system already, because capitalists are consistently asking government to reform its ways in order to support business.
well,
Like
yeah,
it's just part of the game.
and really, hey, it's a hot take, but really, regulation nowadays is basically socialism for the wealthy.
Yeah, I
And
love that concept.
and to be honest, I really think somebody should do a book about it. And I reckon in that hot take, you could get a whole bunch of evidence and say, hey, everyone, socialism actually works because the big banks never failed because of the government intervention.
Right,
Um,
right.
um, uh, Socialism actually works because the wealthy are able to privatize the profits and socialize the losses.
That's right. That's
And
right.
I this is a massive tangent, but I think somebody could be able to do a book about that, and it would actually have legs and would be a
Yeah,
very interesting read.
yeah.
But another tangent that I want to talk about is, well, in I guess in regulation and what we were kind of talking about before, I guess because there isn't any revolutionary parties anymore, that's kind of the reason you have your Professor Richard Wolves and like those kind of figures that are very much focusing on economic democracy. Because if if there isn't any revolutionary politicians, then, or at least socialist parties or communist parties out there that are going to, I guess, politically incentivize the working people within a society, then the next best thing is to, on an individual level, or at least in a community-based level, empower people to um, uh, take back their community economically.
Mm,
And I guess that's the reason why people have been getting much more involved in the cooperative movement. But when they have been able to get politicians on board, get politicians involved in the community wealth building projects.
mm,
And if you're not able to influence a society to make it much more anti-capitalist, much more socialist in its political aspects, then the next best thing is, well, instead of doing a top-down, let's do things bottom up and try to influence as many communities as we can and go from there. So yeah, it's a tangent, but I think it makes sense that if you can't influence society as a whole, then you try to influence as many communities within that society.
Mm. Yeah, we've talked about this notion before. I think when we had a big discussion about like what it is to be anti-capitalist.
Mm,
And yeah, there's like the idea that you could like, if you can't revolutionize through the system, you can revolutionize through from grassroots action, which is like the last bastion of hope, I would say, in all of the liberal democracies that are around the world today. The fact that there is still democracy, we don't have outright dictatorships at the moment, and like outright authoritarianism. Like we have that kind of, you know, veiled by this very flimsy veneer of democracy and democratic systems and stuff like that. But it's still there. And so you
mm,
can, and like I think this can take us back right to the beginning, you can have an effect on the political system because you're dealing with politicians who are not leaders. They are influenced by their constituents because they do want to get re-elected to have any type of to have a job basically and to have
mm,
some form of existence. And so you can have grassroots action which appeals to maybe the politicians or the right politicians at the right time of election and stuff like that, and you might be able to get them to promote your policy or stand up in parliament and speak to your issue, and that might be able to gain traction if you can appeal to enough of them from a grassroots level and use democracy as it was intended to be, as opposed to the democracy that we have now, which is just institutionalized political parties just playing their own games. If people went back to grassroots democracy and really started being the actual lobbyists to their politicians, as opposed to the corporate sector being the only types of people that lobby politicians, but actual
mm,
community groups and actual grassroots organizations being the only people that lobby politicians, then shit would change
mm,
massively. Stuff would change a lot. But like, and that's a framework within the existing system, but like you'd have to the question begs, and that famous saying, I don't know where it's from, but like, if voting actually worked, they'd make it illegal. So if like people did enough of that grassroots stuff and started getting traction on actual like local issues and things that were fundamental to working people as opposed to just the people that rule society and rule the economy and rule things politically, then like they'd probably change the rules to like stamp that behavior out, like what they've done in the American system where they've set up a deliberate two-party system, and like they make all these convoluted like, award systems and point systems and like primaries and all that sort of stuff to try and make sure any third party is weeded out from the very get-go, and then any type of figure that doesn't fit within the political elites like kind of structure and like kind of like merit system is weeded out. Even if they have popular support of the people, if the party doesn't vote for them, they have the majority vote, and then they can get rid of anyone who's too
mm,
popular and is about to carry some type of popular agenda into like into the White House kind of thing.
mm,
So like their reform, and this is why I said like in the capitalist system, reform happens all the bloody time, and it's always happening to benefit the people that are already in power, and it's usually economic elites and political elites,
mm,
people that control the game anyway. So the system, they'll just turn off and on like, taps here and there to make sure that their power is never diminished and not too much power ever actually falls to the hands of the constituents. And so, like, I don't think reform is the answer. It can get you so far, and you can have some good regulation out there. Like, there's nothing wrong with like the regulation that came out of like the 1970s and things like that. Like around the liberal or the Western world, there was a lot of environmental movements going on, and so like the EPA in America was instituted by a Republican, by Richard Nixon. And so, like, the Environmental Protection Authority came into being because people were pissed off and they wanted some protection of their environment,
mm,
from large-scale industrialists that were just, raping and pillaging the environment like they do. And so people were able to get environmental laws through reform and
mm,
appealing to governments and things like that. But like at the same time, like capitalists will crave regulation as well, like I said, to protect them and their, I guess, their economic interests. But more than that, like, I'll tell you an interesting case. About 10 years ago, all of like the biggest energy um, corporations in America. So like, petroleum corporations, all that type of stuff. They got together, the CEOs of the top energy companies in America got together and wrote a letter to the President of the United States
Okay.
saying, we know we are destroying the environment. Can you please change or bring in some environmental regulations to control our industry before we screw it up too much? And so, like, that's the thing
Really?
about capitalism. It craves regulation. Like, these are CEOs, so they're obviously educated people, and they're probably on the liberal side. And when I say liberal, I mean the American version of liberal, as in, like, they probably have a social conscience of some sort, even though they're like economically conservative. They might be socially like progressive, and they understand the importance of having like a healthy environment
Yeah.
and what that means for their grandchildren. But they lobbied the president and
Yeah.
said, "Can you regulate our industry because we are beholden to the shareholders?" And my job is to maximize shareholder
Oh, yeah.
profits. But I know that what I'm doing by maximizing those profits is laying waste to the environment, which is kind of the thing that I need to be able to breathe. So, like, can you do something about that, please? It was like Karl Marx describes in Das Kapital, like at one point the capitalists like made representation to like royal commissions and stuff, and we're just like, look, we're killing children so fast in our factories because of our like nefarious business practices that we won't have workers in like 10 or 20 years time because we're killing children before they can start reproducing. Can you do something about that, please? Because we can't stop employing them because we need them for our business model. So like reform is a massive part of, and regulation is a massive part of what capitalism works, not only to protect them from outside enemies, but to protect them from themselves.
Yeah.
And so, like, at the end of the day, you can reform capitalism, I think, to protect it. You can protect capitalists from themselves, kind of thing, and to protect everyone else from capitalists.
Mm.
But it's still a reform at the end of the day. And if somebody comes in and thinks that that is not necessary anymore, that can be reformed out again. Ultimately, though, until you change that system, you're always going to get the same result. And there's another famous saying, like in what is it, the measure of a madman or someone who's crazy
Oh,
is
I don't know. You mean the definition?
of
Definition
insanity.
is yeah, when
Doing the
you
same thing
doing thing
repeatedly,
and
expecting a
expecting a
different
different result. Yeah.
like I think we've lived with reformation inbuilt in the system for long enough now to know what it gives us. It gives us quick answers and answers for a time period, but things will eventually show and rear their ugly heads again.
Okay. Well, that's food for thought, and to be honest, that's probably a great way to finish this podcast episode. So before we do end, 2 points. I keep on forgetting, but I'll remember to do it this time. For everyone, we do have a performance on the 6th of May. So that's basically the weekend after May Day at Red Alert 2023. Both I'm playing along with Mr. E at the gig at the Highway and more. You can buy your tickets on surveillanceparty.com, and we'll make sure to leave the link in the description. And yeah, if you're international, don't worry. I'll I'll grab from Surveillance Party the link, and you can watch a live streaming of the event. And of course, last thing is the synthwave art. So the prompt for today was shining a light on politicians, as you can see.
Right. Okay. Okay. Very interesting.
And with that, remember everyone to keep thinking and keep learning. And to sign us off, I'll give it to you, Miss Ray.
Thank you very much, 4IS. And for all of you out there, please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.